I'm so glad to have you with us tonight. My name is Joyce Graff. I'm with the Brookline Rotary Club. I am the secretary of the local club, and I'm the district chairperson for Polio-Plus. And so we wanted to share with you what it takes to end a pandemic. And we hope that you will participate in the program and supply your questions as well. We have a very impressive group convened for you tonight, and I want to pass the baton to our moderator, Carey Goldberg. Carey covers health and science and is the host of WBUR's Common Health section. She's been the Boston bureau chief of the New York Times, a staff Moscow correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, and a health and science reporter for the Boston Globe. So, and she's also, by the way, a Brookline parent. So, Carey, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joyce, and thanks to all the sponsors of this program tonight. It's kind of amazing to me, even after a solid 6 months of covering COVID-19 nonstop, how many burning questions there still are, how many things there still are that we all feel a really urgent need to know. And so I'm especially happy to have with us this extremely distinguished panel tonight. I will introduce them very briefly, then we'll hear from Dr. Ofer Levy about vaccines first, and then he's going to have to go, and then we will continue with other presentations and questions and answers. So with us tonight, we have Michael McGovern. He is the chair of the Rotary International Polio-Plus Committee. He represents Rotary on the Polio Oversight Board of the Global Polio Eradication Initiative. Thanks to this effort, Africa was declared polio-free in August. And he can give us some of the big picture about what it takes to end a pandemic. Dr. Thomas Tsai is a surgeon at Brigham and Women's Hospital and an assistant professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. Dr. Tsai is a senior fellow at the Harvard Global Health Institute, where he's leading the institute's research on the effect of COVID-19 on the United States healthcare system and development of national testing targets. So he'll be our target for most of our testing questions. Also with us, Dr. Ofer Levy is director of the Precision Vaccines Program and Senior Associate Physician in Medicine in the Division of Infectious Diseases at Boston Children's Hospital. The Precision Vaccines Program employs multidisciplinary approaches to make safe and effective vaccines for vulnerable populations, such as the young and elderly, although I'd say all of us are feeling fairly vulnerable right now. So he will be our vaccine expert. And last but very much not least, Dr. Jenifer Lowe is a physician serving as the medical director for the Boston Public Health Commission. She's also a member of the Department of Family Medicine at Boston University School of Medicine. In her role, Dr. Lowe shapes public health policy for the city of Boston. So she's our go-to public health person on all kinds of issues of public health and also equity in particular. So let's start. Dr. Levy, would you please present on vaccines and in particular give us a sense of the outlook for, I think, what we're all wondering, which is when, oh Lord, when are we going to get a vaccine?
Thank you for that, Carey, and for the opportunity to present today. It's really an honor and obviously a critically important topic. So my talk is entitled The Race for a Coronavirus Vaccine. It's just a few slides giving you a sense of what we have before us. Obviously, to address this pandemic, public health measures are key. The social distancing, the masks, the washing of the hands. We don't want to lose sight of those critical components. And a potential game changer would be a safe and effective vaccine. As we know, the current administration has put a lot of money towards something called the Warp Speed Initiative, 5 or 6 vaccines. A lot of money has been poured into those. They are in clinical trials at various phases, 1, 2, and 3. We believe there'll be more data coming in the coming weeks and months, and hopefully those data look good in terms of supporting safety and yes, efficacy of at least some of these vaccines. I'm going to tell you a little bit from my perspective as a physician scientist, as an infectious disease expert at Boston Children's Hospital, as director of the Precision Vaccines Program, as a professor at Harvard Medical School, an associate member at MIT's Broad Institute, what this race looks like from our end. And as you see in my first slide here, I highlight that what's generally known about infectious diseases in the world, not just COVID, but all infectious diseases, is there tends to be a pattern that the number of infectious caused deaths here on the y-axis as a function of the age of the individuals who are dying of infections is very much a U-shaped distribution. And by that we mean that most infections in the world strike hardest when we're very young and when we're very old. And we believe that that reflects the change in our immune system with age. There's a famous philosophical saying, the only constant thing in life is change. And the immune system is no different. From the day we are born to the day we die, the immune system is changing. And our team at Boston Children's Hospital is employing some very sophisticated approaches to understand the age specific changes in immunity and how they relate to infection and to the efficacy of vaccines, which is a critical topic tonight. Now, this is also playing out, of course, in the COVID pandemic. As we know, people who are older are at higher risk of severe COVID or even COVID death, and might also present with unusual symptoms. As we also know, children, although less susceptible to COVID death, can get serious multi-organ inflammatory conditions. I've consulted on some of those children at Boston Children's Hospital. And so very much this concept that age affects how an infection plays out is holding true in COVID. And age, now, if we believe the immune system changes are underlying, because to simplify a very complicated field, the immune system is relatively weaker when we're just born and when we're very old. And think about that. That has two implications. Number one, at those ages, you're more susceptible to infectious diseases. And number two, by the same principle, it may be more challenging to effectively immunize you. Just in the subpopulations that we most want to protect, their distinct immunity might pose a challenge to get a robust vaccine response. We see this with influenza. We should all get our flu vaccine. I just got mine this morning. And our elders need them more than ever because they're at high risk of severe flu. And often the response isn't as robust to the vaccine when we're older as we would wish it were to fully protect them. And we hope that won't be the case with the COVID vaccines, but it may well be. So there's, ideally vaccines would be one size fits all. You invent a vaccine and it works perfectly in every subgroup, in every age group. However, 100 years of experience in vaccines teaches us that many factors tend to impact vaccine responses. Your sex, if you're young or if you're older, if you give a vaccine in the summer or winter, if you give a vaccine alone or together with other vaccines, if you give a live weakened germ, or if you give a piece of a microbe like a protein. If you give the same vaccine in one part of the world or another, you might get a different response because of genetic and epigenetic differences in the population. So everything seems to matter. And that's the rationale for our precision vaccines program based at Boston Children's Hospital. It's really largely funded by NIH, by Tony Fauci's National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. And it's really a platform to enhance collaboration between academia, industry, and government to develop vaccines for vulnerable populations. 3 projects I want to highlight to you that our program is undertaking to address the COVID pandemic. One is understanding the interaction of this coronavirus with the human immune system. Why? Because the better we understand the human immune response to the virus, we can understand the types of responses that are associated with successfully clearing the virus and recovering versus getting very sick or, God forbid, dying. And those lessons may inform vaccine efforts, they may inform prognostic biomarkers, they may inform therapeutics. And so in partnership with NIH, we are undertaking a study called Immunophenotyping Assessment in a COVID cohort, or IMPACT. This is a national study of 1,000 to 2,000 adults across the United States, ages 18 years and older. And now we're up to 15 biomedical centers. And we are following patients from the moment they're admitted to hospital up to 12 months through convalescence, collecting a lot of clinical data, but also 10 biosample time points, blood, urine, nasal swabs, to track not just the virus and its clearance, but also the host immune response, how your white blood cells and the components of your immune systems, your antibodies, fight the virus. And we can compare those who had a light course, who were in the hospital for 1 or 2 days and went home and did fine, versus those who had a very severe course, went to the ICU or, God forbid, even died, and compare the differences in each of the tubes we're collecting. And we are tracking 200,000 biosamples. Each of those samples, we will measure hundreds of thousands of analytes, cells, white blood cells, proteins, DNA, RNA, etc., and then do a massive data integration across the United States to get a deep dive as to how the human immune system responds to this virus and how that varies between men and women, young and old, people with different body mass index, people with different drugs, smokers versus non-smokers. Many questions will be asked of this data. And these insights will help inform new biomarkers, therapeutics, vaccines. Our second major project, we don't want to lose sight of the most vulnerable. We are aiming to build a coronavirus vaccine that's optimized for the elderly. You see, most vaccine development in the world historically has been hit or miss. You come up with an idea for a vaccine, you might work at it at the bench, you might inject it into a mouse to show that, you know, the mouse is okay after the injection and makes antibodies and appears protected from the infection, eventually trial it in humans. But we do things a different way. We want to keep in mind the most vulnerable populations with respect to a given infection, in this case, the elderly. And for that, we believe it may be the case, we don't know, because we don't have the results yet on the warp speed vaccines. We believe in the coming weeks and months we will, but we don't have all those results yet. But we suspect, based on what's known on other vaccines, that it's possible that the response of the elderlies might not be as robust, the immune response of the vaccine, as we would like to protect them. Now, don't get me wrong. If in a few months we announce good news, one or more of these warp speed vaccines appear safe and is protecting 50, 60, 70%, that's huge news, because right now we're comparing it to what? We have nothing. So it'll be a great step forward, but the research will continue. Because how about a vaccine that doesn't require 2 doses? I mean, it's hard enough to immunize 300 million Americans. Now try to do that twice, you know? Or what about if the elders give a much weaker response and are only 40% protected? Again, we don't have the data yet, but it's quite possible, based on what we've seen with other vaccines, that we run into these issues. One answer to those challenges might be molecules we call adjuvants. Adjuvants come from the Latin adjuvar, to help or aid. These are molecules that boost an immune response. They're like rocket fuel for the immune system. If you see the top panel, that shows you what happens when you inject a simple vaccine. It just has the antigen. Antigen is from antibody generating substance. You inject it, it gets gobbled up by white blood cells that talk to other white blood cells. You make antibodies that may protect you. But what often happens is you make some antibodies, then a few weeks later they come right back down, and you need multiple doses to stay protected. You know, many of those childhood vaccines, you need multiple doses. We are trying to build single shot protection vaccines, and those involve the adjuvant. That's in the red star here. And to simplify matters, when you inject it with the adjuvant, if it's a good adjuvant, you get a super activation of the white blood cells, and you get durable and strong immune responses. So we haven't proven this. This is a proof of concept for other vaccines with adjuvants. For example, Shingrix, which is a varicella vaccine for older individuals, has an adjuvantation system developed by GlaxoSmithKline. I don't own any stock with them or anything, but that vaccine, which is licensed and on the market, has an amazing rate of protection in the elders who suffer the zoster, right? Why? Because it has the special sauce, the adjuvant in it, that activates the elderly immune system. So we are doing a systematic search. Which molecules could be added to a coronavirus vaccine to ensure it works optimally in the most vulnerable? How do we do that? We have elderly individuals who donate, study participants, donate some blood to our program, and then we test it outside the body in culture cell dishes, and we test thousands of small molecules and see which one would activate the elderly white blood cells, the human elderly white blood cells outside the body. And then those molecules go into our test vaccine and go into the mice. So this is a completely crazy way to build a vaccine. That's not, across 100 years of human history, nobody built a vaccine this way. We're putting the humans up front before we go to the mice, because it doesn't go into the mice unless it proves to us that it's going to work in the elderly, at least outside the body. So to the extent that our system models that, we believe that this will accelerate and de-risk a vaccine that would protect the elderly. Of course, the antigen would be the spike protein. You know, coronavirus is like a ball with spikes on it. We believe antibodies against that spike will protect against infection. All the warp speed vaccines, whether they're mRNA or other types of vaccines, adenovirus vectors, in one way or another are based on the spike protein. The third,
I'm so sorry to interrupt. You've hit your 10-minute mark, so do your number
okay,
3
really fast.
quick.
The last project is asking, can a 100-year-old tuberculosis vaccine called Bacillus McGovern or BCG protect against COVID? This is one of the most commonly administered vaccines in world history. 100 million babies get it a year to prevent disseminated tuberculosis in early life, leaves a scar. Increasing evidence that it broadly revs up the immune system to protect against a variety of viruses, including potentially flu and coronavirus. We are about to stand up a phase 2 human study based at the Brigham and Women's Hospital with Lindsay Baden, BCG to prevent COVID in healthcare workers. This is to roll out in November, and stay tuned for details on that. It's a completely different concept. It's a non-specific vaccine to protect against all viruses. We hope that works, and that's coming up soon. And we're trying to set up after that a study in the elderly and in nursing homes with the same concept. Many people on the team to thank, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So let's move from all of your big data with immunophenotyping and with trying 1,000 different adjuvants. And let me get right up to a simple personal question to you, Ofer. At what point will you get a vaccine and have it given to your children?
Right, so that's a great question. That's the crux of the matter. I will also say that in the past, I've been a part-time employee of the US government. I served for the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, on the Vaccines and Related Biologic Products Advisory Committee. I used to fly to Washington, DC every month and give advice on flu vaccines, Ebola, vaccines and pregnancy. So I have seen these master files, the thousands of pages that companies file with FDA, and then this expert panel advises FDA should this be approved or not. Now, of course, my comments are not official government comments. It's my own personal opinions, but they come with a lot of experience. It boils down to safety and efficacy. In the coming weeks and months, there will be a lot of data coming out. You've heard of the Moderna trial. There are 4 or 5 other large companies that have vaccines in advanced testing, Pfizer and others, and we're going to see this data coming out. And we're going to have, FDA is going to have a process. They're going to have an expert panel review all that data and advise the FDA, and FDA will decide, is there an emergency use authorization? Does the data look good enough? It starts with safety. There are certain things that are acceptable. You know, I got a flu vaccine this morning. I did, and my arm's a little sore, but it's better than getting the flu. So that's okay. But is there a larger safety signal? Severe reactogenicity is the rapid side effects, swelling, pain, tenderness in the arm, fever. If that's very severe, that might be a problem if you want to give that to 300 million people, right? Or are there rare side effects? Those are harder to pick up in a small, rapid trial. And remember, vaccines also get blamed for a lot of things that they don't cause. Because if everybody gets a vaccine, and then all of us at one point, or not all, but some of us at one point or another will have something bad happen to our health, and is that due to a vaccine, or was that going to happen anyway? So we really need very rigorous statistical analysis, and not hearsay, and not rare events that are not really correlated. So we have to be balanced. We have to be open-minded that safety comes first for something you're going to give to healthy people, and at the same time, we can't unfairly blame vaccines for things they're not. They didn't cause. So this is a long-winded way of saying, in the coming months, when those data come out, FDA is going to convene those expert panels. Those panels are going to vote on, for each separate warp speed vaccine, do the data support safety? Do they support efficacy? Those are 2 separate determinations. And we might have some vaccines that are safe, but not very effective. Some that are effective, but there's some concern about a safety signal. What do we do then? Or what if it's safe, but it's only 40% effective, 50%? That's a pretty weak efficacy. On the other hand, compared to what? If we have nothing right now, some really hard public health decisions will have to be made. And the kids is a whole different matter, because to my knowledge, there are no large scale trials of coronavirus vaccine in children right now. But children also need protection for a number of reasons. Number one is they can get these severe inflammatory syndromes, and I've seen children land in the hospital with them. And number two, of course, they may spread the infection to older individuals. So we're never going to really get complete herd protection without immunizing any of the younger people in the population. On the other hand, safety and efficacy can be age dependent. So unless you do the study in that population, how do you know? I do know that some of the warp speed studies are including the elderly, so that's helpful. We'll see how the data look in them versus the middle age, but the pediatric is a question mark right now. And I think that's going to lag.
So I want to press you on just one aspect of this. The vaccine process has clearly become politicized. Do you trust what the FDA will come out with? Will you, in fact, if and when they recommend a vaccine as being safe enough and effective enough, will that be good enough for you?
I believe it will be. Obviously, as a scientist, show me the data. You know, I want to see these data published. I want the public to have it, and especially scientists and physicians around the world to be able to look at it and form opinions of it. In general, I have been impressed by the process. It's a serious process, and I will trust the process, but not blindly. I'd like to see what the data look like. Those hearings, at least traditionally, have had a big component that are open to the public. So these are usually discussed in big chunks of it in public, and there's usually time for public commentary. That's at least the sessions I've been at. So I think it is a rigorous process, not a perfect process, because any human process is imperfect, because us humans are imperfect, and we're trying to do things quickly, much faster than ever before. Most vaccines have taken 10 to 20 years to develop. We don't have that kind of time. Now, they're scaling these vaccines, they're building them even before we know which vaccine works, which is also a challenge. So we're in a very delicate moment. On the other hand, as the process as I've traditionally seen it play out, I do believe in, and I am cautiously optimistic that it'll be the proper process this time as well.
Okay, I hope you can go public when you get the vaccine so we can all know that it's time. We're getting lots and lots of questions, and I know you have to go and we need to get to the other panelists, so I'm going to throw them at you rapid fire. Okay. Please answer them as quickly as you can. Okay. Okay, question one from the audience. If you have an immune deficiency disorder and have antibody deficiencies, will a vaccine work?
Well, that depends on the vaccine and the severity of your immune deficiency disorder. If you have a very, if you're very, first of all, if you have some types of severe immunodeficiency, you should not get any live vaccine, because then the live vaccine that's a weakened germ that wouldn't be dangerous in somebody whose immune system is robust, can be dangerous to somebody with a very weak immune system. So that's one statement to make. Another statement to make is if the part of your immune system that makes antibodies is not working, and if antibodies is what protects you, then that might be a failure rate right there. You might benefit from passive immunization, like the Regeneron approach, where you have antibodies. I believe the president received that during his recent hospitalization in Walter Reed, which would be antibodies, monoclonal antibodies against the coronavirus. That might be an alternative approach for such an individual.
And a related question, should immunocompromised elderly worry about the COVID vaccine? You kind of answered that.
Well, yeah, again, it depends on which immunocompromising condition they have, and they should consult with their physician. Yeah.
Great. When will we see data on durability of the various vaccines, including that adjuvant platform?
Right. So that's one, in my mind, there are multiple reasons an adjuvant may be part of the answer here. Adjuvants can turn a weak response into a stronger response. Adjuvants can have dose sparing, so you need one dose, hopefully, instead of two. Adjuvants can increase durability of the response. And we don't know now with a warp speed, I believe they're going to ask for at least 2 months of safety follow-up. So then we will know at least several months of durability, but we're not going to know whether the vaccine is going to protect for years. Think about it. The studies just started a few months ago. So if we're going to render a decision as a society in the coming months, we're not going to know with confidence that the vaccine will protect you for years. This may be like the flu, where you need yearly doses. That's why I'm telling people, the day we get a safe and effective vaccine will be a great day, and the urgent research will continue for the next generation coronavirus vaccines that can hopefully protect you with fewer doses, protect the vulnerable, protect for long duration.
Right, got it. What percentage of the population needs to get vaccinated to create herd immunity?
Excellent question. I've seen estimates. I'm not a biostatistician, but I've seen published estimates that if this is approximate, if the vaccine has 80% efficacy, then maybe you need 85% of the population immunized to get that robust herd immunity. Yeah.
A lot. Okay.
That's a very rough, but that was based on one published study. There may be other models, other studies. That was one study I've seen.
Okay. In which vaccine platform do you have the most confidence in terms of safety and durability? There are early studies from the Moderna vaccine indicate a high fever rate. The tried and true adjuvants of traditional vaccines seem to be safest, but they're further behind the others. So what horse are you betting on?
I think we have to have multiple shots on goal. And I do think it was good that the Warp Speed placed bets not on 1 or 2, but 6. And there are, as you know, approximately 150 to 200 vaccine approaches in development. So hopefully with so many shots on goal, we'll get something, hopefully sooner than later.
Okay. When do you think the first pediatric vaccine trials will happen? And then this person says, I haven't seen a pediatric trial on the landscape.
This is a real issue. It's an issue in vaccinology. It's an issue in medicine, special populations, pregnant women, children. The US Congress has passed the Pediatric Research Initiative because time and again, women and children get left out of certain medical research. Obviously, safety first, but there needs to be some sort of presumption of inclusion ethically. What does it mean for society to say we don't even think about including, so as a pediatrician, we deal with this a lot. A lot of the drugs we give in the hospital, pediatric drugs, are given off label because nobody's ever done proper dose finding. It's the situation's improved somewhat because the government has required this a bit under the Clinton administration, others. There've been some improvement, but still a ways to go. I don't know, because they need to start the studies. That drumbeat is starting. I hear it in the public discourse, and I would imagine, I don't know any insider information, but I would imagine in the coming weeks and months, committees are going to start convening about how do we get the kids on board. And then you need to set up the studies, need to conduct them. So it could be a year away.
Last question. Thank you so much for staying, and I apologize to all the people who sent in vaccine questions that we couldn't get to. Here it is. Recent polls indicate a huge drop in the percentage of Americans willing to take a COVID vaccine, and more worrying, a general lack of confidence in the research process. How can the medical community restore this trust?
I think we need to devote more resources, and that's not just money. That's really time and expertise in describing the science to the lay public. I think this is absolutely critical. I mean, even before COVID, vaccine hesitancy has been a huge issue. 90+% of this content in social media on vaccines is anti-vax. And then layer on top of that, that this is all playing out of control during a political campaign. I've been interviewed on CNN and other outlets, and the people interviewing me, I was interviewed on Fox News, etc. They're always trying to push me to make some political statement. And I'm like, I'm sorry, this virus doesn't know politics. Science is science. But we do have to do a better job describing to the lay public what we're doing, why, what are the safeguards in place, and what are the checks and balances in the system to try to deliver a safe and effective product.
Great. Dr. Ofer Levy, thank you so very much for being with us.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And let's move on to Michael McGovern from Rotary.
Thank you very much, Carey, and thank you for inviting me to this session. The reason someone from Rotary was invited to participate tonight is that we've been working on polio eradication since 1979. And when you hear about polio eradication, you're thinking, wow, why are we still talking about polio eradication? And how does this have anything to do with the coronavirus? Jonas Salk came out with his vaccine in 1955. I was born in 56. That was 65 years ago. And it was in 1979, some Rotarians of the Philippines said, this isn't right. You live in the United States, you don't get polio, but you live in the Philippines, our kids are still getting polio. So they asked Rotary to help out. And, 3 years later, there was no more polio in the Philippines. So, Rotary said, well, if this could be done in the Philippines, why can't we do it in the rest of the world? And we enlisted the support of WHO, UNICEF, the CDC, and eventually the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Gavi. And we began something called the Global Polio Eradication Initiative. This was in 1988. And here we are 32 years later, there is still polio in the world. And we've gone from 350,000 paralytic cases a year down to only 2 countries, Pakistan and Afghanistan. But we had a goal of finishing this in 2005. And, so you think of, if it's polio and what everyone knows about polio, and you can't get that done, what are the lessons that we've learned for trying to get other vaccines and eliminate other diseases? As I mentioned, we have worked country by country, but it's taken persistence, it's taken passion, it's taken money, and it's really taken partnerships. And and these are just a highlight. And I'm not a doctor. You get great experts. I really enjoyed the last presentation. But what we have learned, and we actually spend still eradicating polio. We, meaning the partnership, about $1 billion a year. We're immunizing 450,000 children, but we're spending about 35% of our budget on social mobilization. That's not the delivery system. That's the billboards. It's the community influences. It's trying to convince people that they should actually get those 2 polio drops in the mouth. And that's not easy. We've accomplished it in all but the 2 countries, but it's still a challenge to sustain it in Africa, which was declared free of the wild polio virus in August. It's still a challenge in India as well. So, first of all, you need very clear messaging. There's a lot of, I'm trying to think of the right word, cross currents. I'm trying to be non-political. There's a lot of cross currents out there. And, it's, we just heard the statistics of the vaccine hesitancy. And, you need the government with one clear message. When I say the government, you need the governments throughout the world. You need the WHO, you need the CDC, you need the government in China, and you need the government in the United States. Everyone's got to be working together down the same path. And, COVID, we're not saying that. You need community leader support. Things happen, and vaccines, I point to the mouth, we use oral polio vaccine. Vaccines get in the mouths because there's local community people who are the delivery system. Rotary is out there. We have Rotarians all over the world, 1.2 million of us. We encourage that, but we pay stipends to particularly women because they're the people respected to deliver vaccines, and we're paying them stipends throughout the world through WHO and UNICEF to actually put the polio drops in the mouths. And people are a lot more ready to take a vaccine when it's not some unknown person who's telling them to do it, when it's the next door neighbor. We've been heavily involved with celebrity endorsers. And I know, that sounds a little, but it makes a difference in a lot of people. The basketball player, the ballet dancer, the international model. We have one in Brazil. And those celebrity endorsers, Jack Nicklaus is one. But Jack Nicklaus, he's well known, but he doesn't appeal to the kid on the street in Nigeria, in Cote d'Ivoire, in Afghanistan. So, we need celebrity endorsers who are recognized in a particular country. We need constant innovation. The doctors are far more expert than I am, but if you look at the original Salk vaccine, the original Sabin vaccine, that has evolved over the years. And, we're continuing to invest in vaccine research. We're continuing to, really study the modeling. And there's actually a group at Harvard that helps us with that, of understanding, I'm not a doctor, but, patches that help to deliver vaccines and other delivery and technical systems. And, as the world changes, as people expectations are different, you need to have that constant intervention. You need to be ready for social media. We had an example in Pakistan a year and a half ago, where we were doing polio drops in a particular community. And suddenly on the afternoon we were doing it, a posting appeared on Facebook and WhatsApp, and it showed all of these kids passing out on the floor. And they showed them a little video giving them polio drops. Well, the vials they were using weren't the ones used by the polio program. But that week, 200,000 kids ended up going to hospitals in that part of Pakistan, claiming that they were sick as a result of the polio vaccine. The hospitals didn't find a single kid who was sick, and eventually the videos the government confiscated the videos and they showed them actually rehearsing the kids getting sick. And sadly, that's what you deal with in today's world. There are people out there with vaccines who, yes, there are some issues with vaccines, and I understand that. I've had some trouble with statins myself, but it's there are people out there, and it's not so much they're against the vaccine; they're anti-government elements, and they want to show that the government is in control, is not in control, and it's not responsible. So you need to be ready for anything. You need to know there's always going to be an expert on television who disagrees with what the experts say. And, eradicating a disease is not easy. Polio, it's been 65 years. We're confident that the partnership, the governments, the support of, all those things I've indicated, that we're going to get it eradicated. But, you need patience. You need passion. We need these medical experts. It's as much, it's not just medicine, it's psychology, it's sociology, and it's all these elements that come into play. So, Rotary's, very proud of its work. We have put over $1 billion of our own money, Rotarians, into the effort to eradicate polio. We've helped to raise about another $20 billion from the governments. We're happy to have recruited the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation to the polio eradication effort. And you got to remember, we're only immunizing kids under the age of 5. And you just think of the magnitude of the billions of people around the world, all of whom have, different makeups of their systems. And, I just thank goodness for our medical community who's working on this. And thank goodness for events like this that help everyone understand. So, Carey, very good to be with you tonight. And I look forward to the other presenters.
Thank you so much, Michael. I have a very quick follow-up question, which is, given everything that you've learned from polio, and given that we don't have a vaccine yet, what is the one most important thing that you think needs to be done right now to fight the coronavirus?
Personally, I think the one most important thing is for everyone to stay safe. Follow the advice of the CDC. Secondly, don't rush a vaccine before it's ready. We have a new vaccine coming out to deal with something called vaccine-derived polio, and it's been under study, funded by the Gates Foundation for 10 years. We applied for the first ever early use license from WHO. It's taken over a year, and we still don't have it. So, don't put something out there that is going to be a public relations disaster. Make sure it's safe and it's right to the greatest degree possible before putting it out there.
Thank you. Moving on, next, testing. Dr. Thomas Tsai, all yours.
Thank you, Carey. I'll first start with a snapshot of where we are in the United States and Massachusetts and talk a little bit about our work at the Harvard Global Health Institute to develop a risk level dashboard. And I want to use most of my introduction to cover 5 key themes and to really set the stage for some of the questions from the audience today. But in the US today, currently there are 7.4 million confirmed cases of COVID-19 so far and over 203,000 deaths. And what that means is right now, the pandemic is still surging. We started off with a peak in April. We're supposed to go down into a valley, but what we ended up with was with a plateau. That plateau has turned into a mountain range, and we're very still in the midst of that mountain range currently. There are 9 states that are currently hotspots in the United States. Those are states with over 25 per 100,000 new cases on a 7-day moving average. And that's North Dakota, South Dakota, Wisconsin, Utah, Montana, Idaho, Iowa, Nebraska, and Arkansas. And what we've seen is a shift of the pandemic geographically from the Northeast to the South and Southwest, and now to the upper Midwest. What about Massachusetts? We're starting to see a small rise in cases again. 454 cases yesterday, 8 deaths, and a 1.1% test positive rate. What Massachusetts has been an exemplar of is a commitment to testing and commitment to focusing on the data to guide our policy making. And Massachusetts is the only state in the nation currently that is meeting suppression targets for COVID-19. And what that means is, at the work at the Harvard Global Health Institute, we've been collaborating with the Brown School of Public Health with one of my colleagues, Ashish Jha, who's a current dean at the Brown School of Public Health, as well as with the Harvard Stafford Center for Ethics to develop a risk level dashboard. And what we see, and these dashboards are available at globalepidemics.org. What we wanted to do was to bring around a convergence effort. Everybody was talking about testing rates across different populations, per 10,000 individuals, per million individuals, and people weren't really linking the guidelines around reopening, initially around the reopening the economy from a lockdown, now in terms of schools, to what the overall surrounding community level risk is. So our risk level dashboard, and you could bring up that first slide, brings it down to the county level in our own backyards and shows what the risk of community level transmission is in every single county in the United States, broken down to green, yellow, orange, and red levels off the instant number of new cases. We then also developed national testing targets. And if you could bring up the last slide, we have been collaborating with National Public Radio, NPR, to develop new monthly targets of what the testing thresholds should be. And the story which was published last week, these are some of the numbers from the NPR story, really illustrates the key trade-offs at stake as we look at changing the role of testing from a more reactive one based on diagnosing individuals to a more proactive one based off of testing asymptomatic individuals. That really means, we need to make a decision as a country about who to test, because the number of tests that are needed become astronomical. So this is a phase of the pandemic where we start to think about the essential health workers, students, and really the populations that we value. And if we do value them, what that means in terms of a national testing strategy. And thank you, that's the last slide. So I wanted to transition to 5 key themes to set the stage for, I think, how we should think about the pandemic in this current phase. The first is that we've been treading water. The analogy I like to use during the pandemic is that we're swimming in the ocean, the shore is in sight, there's a current, a riptide, coming against us. And what we've been doing, and I mean we in terms of the federal national strategy, is to tread water, holding our breaths for the moment that a vaccine is going to come. But as you heard from Michael, you heard from Dr. Levy, even when the vaccine comes, it's not going to be 100% effective. For polio, it's taken decades to eradicate. So even when the vaccine does come, it doesn't mean that we need to stop following through with our good public health guidance around masking, testing, contact tracing, and physical distancing. So what we need to do is move to a phase from not just treading water, but have the resolve to really swim towards shore. And that's what we mean by moving from just mitigating the pandemic to really trying to suppress a pandemic. And it can be done. And one example is New Zealand, which is entering from its second lockdown just today. But now there are no cases of COVID-19 in New Zealand. Different story, smaller country, it's an island, but I think it's an example of the resolve that's needed. The second theme is that we're in a new phase of the pandemic. We're moving from this reactive mode of testing around really the medical diagnostic infrastructure of somebody coming in with symptoms. We're basically confirming that they have COVID-19 with a molecular test, such as PCR tests. And now with new technologies coming, such as antigen tests that can provide results as little as 15 minutes, we need to rethink what the role of testing should be. It's no longer about confirming individuals with symptoms, but it's about using testing as part of an overall strategy to reopen the economy in a safe way. And the way I like to think about it is we need to use testing to create the conditions for safety. When we drive on the road, we don't argue about, do I wear a seatbelt, or use an airbag, or stop at a stop sign, or stop at a stoplight. We do all of the above. I think that's the third key theme, is that it is really an all the above approach. I think, part of the discourse during the pandemic has been Is it masking? Is it testing? Is it contact tracing? Or is it a vaccine? Is it the RNA vaccine? Is it the live vaccine? And I think that's the wrong way to think about this. What we've known is from the pandemic and from other countries from the last several months is that we need all of the above. There is not going to be a single vaccine. There's going to be multiple different vaccines. We've seen some of the questions from the audience, depending on your own risk profiles. If you're immunocompromised, we may need a different type of vaccine for different groups of individuals. I mean, that's a key thing, is that we need an all hands on deck approach because this pandemic is still going to be with us over the next several months. The third phase is that, as we move towards more rapid testing with antigen testing and more frequently, we need to shift the policy solutions from a supply side only to thinking about the demand side. Most of the funding has been focused on public health labs, and Dr. Lowe and public health is incredibly important, and we should support public health labs. But this is a part of the pandemic where we need to, the previous phase has been focused about getting the noses to the swabs, getting people to the emergency rooms, to the clinics. This is the part of the pandemic we get the swabs to the noses, move the testing into the communities that are most high risk, that are by definition medically underserved. So how do we support the demand for testing when the financial system is actually predicated on the medical system? So even the CARES Act funding is tying testing reimbursement to insurance companies, which need medical doctors to authorize it, to have to be performed in what's called a CLIA certified laboratory setting. And what we need to do is break from that way of thinking and really support the demand for testing, because we hear stories every day of people paying out of pocket for tests, astronomical costs, and that just shouldn't be the case in America in 2020. And they may be voucher programs or free programs, but what we really need to do is to support the test, get the noses to the swabs as well as the swabs to the noses. And the last part, last theme is, as we think about all these issues together, is and that was the heart of the NPR story, is as we have these newer technologies, these newer tests, and that's true for vaccines as well. This is the moment where the policy decisions really involve trade-offs. Do we test college students? Do we test K through 12 students? Do we test the teachers? Do we test the students? Now, these are really hard, hard choices. Do we test the frontline healthcare workers, the doctors, the nurses, or do we test the patients? And I think this is the conversation that we as a town, as a society, really need to be having. Is who do we value the most, and given the resources that we have, how do we use those resources to protect our most vulnerable populations? But like I said, what that means is going to be an all of the above approach, of which testing is a key part. Vaccination will be a key part as well, but it still means that we still need that underlying seatbelt of masking and physical distancing. So these are the 5 key things I think we have to think about as we enter the next phase of the pandemic.
Beautiful, thank you. One quick follow-up question, then we'll get to Dr. Lowe. You may be learning as a relatively new resident that Brookline is a very combative town, and especially its social media. And I think probably the biggest fight I've seen here in a very long time is over, can we send our kids to school? And how many kids can we send? And should the teachers go? And the whole question of in-person learning. And certainly testing is a big part of that. And thus far, I don't think we have any testing set up, although I know it's being discussed, and we have an amazing panel of parents and others looking at science issues in the Brookline Public Schools. But my question for you would be, what do we need to be able to send all our kids back to school?
Yeah, that's a great question, Carey. And we actually have a calculator for that. So on globalepidemics.org, in that NPR story, there is a calculator, a spreadsheet where you can take drop-down menus and move the sliders in terms of, do I value K through 8 students, or do I value K through 12 students? And we've broken it down. I think the key thing to think about is what the overall risk of community level transmission is. Schools are part of the community. The teachers are, the students are, the family members are. We see most of the clusters of infection that are coming from the community to the schools. There's very limited, what we call secondary transmissions of infections happening at school for the most part. So we really need to think what the overall risk in the community is, and base the decisions around in-person versus hybrid versus virtual around the community level risk. But that's contingent upon the ability to mitigate the pandemic in the schools in terms of the resources, masking, the physical space to be able to physically distance. So all those come into play. And, we have a corresponding set of school recommendations. It's a working group of researchers across Harvard, from the School of Education to the School of Public Health, the medical school, to provide some guidance to these things. But it needs to be tied to the data first and foremost. And I think that's where the Commonwealth has done a really great job of providing a risk level map of what the transmission risk is. The risk levels are different than our dashboard, but there isn't a gold standard. This is a new pandemic. The point of these dashboards is to spur these kind of discussions that we're having, because these reflect local values.
And they're very tough questions, I think. Great. Thank you so much for your patience. Dr. Jenifer Lowe, the public health perspective, I think.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak this evening. And as Dr. Levy mentioned, he got a flu shot. I got mine yesterday. I encourage everyone on the call to also get their flu shot. As mentioned, I'm the medical director at Boston Public Health Commission. And our mission at BPHC is to protect, preserve, and promote the health and well-being of Boston residents, particularly the most vulnerable. We envision a thriving Boston where all residents live healthy, fulfilling lives free of racism, poverty, violence, and other systems of oppression. And all residents will have an equitable opportunity and resources leading to optimal health and well-being. Within BPHC, we house the Office of Public Health Preparedness, and through this office, we focus on preparedness, response, and recovery roles dealing with the health and medical impacts of emergencies for the entire region. So this is the punchline. Why was the medical director at Boston Public Health Commission invited to a Brookline-sponsored event? Our Office of Public Health Preparedness works very closely with partners within Boston and the Metro Boston area, including Brookline, as well as state and federal partners on these preparedness activities. So it is important to note that OPHP and the City of Boston have addressed vaccine preparedness since its inception. And I think that the primary reason why I was invited to speak about is thinking about, from a public health perspective, when a vaccine is available, how will it be distributed? So this is something that OPHP thinks about on a regular basis. We create a flu season operations plan every year with key objectives, which are to maintain ongoing situational awareness for our city, our healthcare partners, the general public, and the Metro Boston and state and federal partners. We also develop and implement an equitable vaccine plan in order to reduce disease transmission. We provide timely and accurate public health information on the flu, and we coordinate incident command across the region that I mentioned. So, I recognize that I keep on talking about the flu, and COVID-19 pandemic is clearly the ramifications of the pandemic and the flu are very different than a typical flu season. But I wanted to mention all that background because the City of Boston, and again, our regional partners, have a strong foundation in addressing concerns of equity and prioritization when it comes to vaccine distribution in efforts to reduce the spread of infectious disease. So this includes strong partnerships and communication chains within our community, again, with our state and regional partners. And so, as we think about the vaccine development and how COVID-19 vaccine will be distributed, we have to recognize that we do have an existing infrastructure in place in which we can build the foundation of vaccine distribution. So when it comes specifically to COVID-19 vaccine, there are a couple of key points I wanted to mention. So Dr. Tsai said it very eloquently, but just to repeat, this vaccine is just one tool at our disposal to reduce the spread of the disease. Face coverings, social distancing, frequent testing, hand washing, these are all critical when it comes to any respiratory illness, and there is no silver bullet that's going to solve our problem. So even when we do have a vaccine available, it is imperative that we utilize all the tools that we have at our disposal to stop the spread of the disease, including the vaccine. It's just one piece of a very large puzzle. The second point I wanted to make about COVID-19 specifically is that many of organizations, including Center for Disease Control and the National Academies for Sciences, Medicine, and Engineering, have discussed priority groups. Again, this is something that Dr. Tsai talked about from the testing perspective, that who it should be prioritized for receiving vaccines. And these priority groups, although there's still a lot of discussion, there is a general understanding that the groups that we prioritize are healthcare personnel, essential workers, and individuals at a higher risk of getting the disease. So when the vaccine becomes available, those groups tend to be the ones that are thought of as we develop this prioritization framework. But I do want to highlight it. It's important to recognize that it's not just a prioritization of those groups, it's also about equity that exists within the prioritization framework. So we can say that vaccines should go to healthcare personnel, but we're not just talking about physicians and nurses. We're talking about nursing assistants, medical assistants, and other support staff within healthcare facility that make our healthcare system run. And a lot of these other support staff fall into the demographic categories that have been most impacted by COVID-19. Similarly, essential workers we're not just talking about firefighters, police, and paramedics or EMS. We're talking about homeless shelter workers, our grocery baggers. There's a lot of people who have kept our world running during this crisis, and they're essential workers and should have access to the vaccine as well when it comes to this prioritization framework. Thirdly, again, Dr. Tsai and I have hit similar points, but him from the testing angle, me from the vaccine angle, but it still follows the importance of data in helping to help shape our efforts moving forward when we talk about the vaccine. So since the beginning of the pandemic, Boston Public Health Commission, as well as many institutions in the state, have looked at data. So BPHC specifically looks at data on a daily basis. We look at total counts by race, ethnicity, neighborhood, gender, and age, and using that data that we shape our response to the virus. At the local level, we will continue to use the data to help shape our COVID-19 vaccine strategy so that we can be most effective in stopping the spread of the disease. And finally, and most importantly, again, this has been touched upon. Mike McGovern actually touched upon this with examples of polio vaccine. We can create the most effective vaccine ever. It can be zero side effects, cheap, accessible, eliminate all boundaries from a scientific, clinical, cost perspective. None of that will matter if our community, our patients, our neighborhoods, if we don't trust it, if they don't trust us, as healthcare providers, as scientists, as public health official and as government officials and healthcare system, it's our responsibility to engage the community, especially communities of color that, there is a reason for this distrust. There are historical events that communities of color have experienced that have caused this mistrust in the healthcare system. So again, the onus is on public health officials, healthcare system to address this trust, and it's our responsibility to really engage the community, especially these communities who have been disenfranchised. We have to engage them in all aspects of recovery and response, education, treatment, vaccine development, and distribution. So it's this engagement. Dr. Levy talked about this a little bit. It's not just about educating, it's about actually engaging and listening to what their concerns are and how, understanding really how we can earn their trust back and provide these resources so that individuals can understand the benefits of vaccination. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's actually a question that came in that follows right on what you just said, Jenifer. It says, given people of color have higher incidence of COVID-19, how will the government convince people to get the vaccine who remember the Tuskegee study, which damaged the trust of the Black community toward public health efforts? So you were saying engagement, but can you just paint a little bit more? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I think engagement at the local level is key. Again, Michael McGovern mentioned it in getting women who are trusted individuals to administer the vaccine, to communicate about the benefits of the vaccine. And I'm not talking about paying people who don't really believe it. I mean, we want to have these conversations and say, what are your concerns? Are there facts and data that your peers have experienced and know about and can share with you to convince you. I think identifying someone that they trust to communicate or have experienced themselves to communicate this is really going to be important. So that engagement piece has to very much happen at the local level.
That totally makes sense. Okay, we only have about 15 minutes left and we have like 50 questions. So I propose a sort of a rapid fire. Why don't everybody unmute yourselves? I'm going to throw out these questions. I imagine Jenifer, you do most of the public health. Tom, you'll do most of the testing, but anyone can do anything. Okay, ready? Here we go. Are face shields as effective as masks in protecting someone from the virus?
No.
Okay, good. Really? Yeah, that was fast, but roughly how much less?
Well, so face masks are effective because they cover the mask completely. There's no spread of air. So if you can imagine a shield, it's a respiratory droplet. So if it can spread, if you're coughing, if you're sneezing, if you're singing, and these respiratory droplets are coming outside from these masks, these face shields rather, they're not as effective as a mask that adheres to your face.
What should be done to protect children playing in youth sports?
I can answer that as well. So I think the social distancing practices are just as key in youth sports. I think masking and, it is more difficult to wear a mask when you're engaging in sports. So frequent mask breaks when people can maintain 6 feet of different distance, doing it in a well-ventilated area is important. So I think adhering to some of those principles and recognizing that you have to make accommodations, given that it's not all sports can maintain that distance effectively. So how do you make adjustments to take into account those public health recommendations?
I'll add one thing. I was actually speaking to a parent who was tasked by his son's hockey league to come up with a contact tracing platform. And I told him he doesn't need to come up with his own contact tracing platform. The Commonwealth has a very great contact tracing platform with Partners in Health. And I think that's a key message, is that we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We need to trust the public health system. There's testing there's this whole system that's been thought out. So I think that's a key message for all the different sports leagues, is follow the guidance. You don't need to reinvent the guidance. And answer the phone if you get called by a contact tracer, answer the phone. Less than 25% of contact tracers are being completed because individuals aren't providing the information, they're not answering their phone. So I think that's more important than coming up with your own league specific set of guidelines.
Okay, Tom, when will we have a fast and reliable test like a home pregnancy test? So
the technology is actually already here. What's been challenging is FDA regulations. And then this goes back to my fifth theme about the issue around demand and payment. So some of these paper strip tests that use CRISPR or other technologies, the technology is here, but they're not scalable yet because the FDA still, the EUAs still authorize tests for symptomatic individuals that have to be done by clinicians and medical labs. Even the CRISPR certified labs, their paper strips are fast and cheap. They have to perform in a lab. You can't be in your home doing a little CRISPR test on a paper strip. So, so the antigen tests are here for be able to done at home with some of the droplets. They're not approved for that purpose. So I think that's a bit disconnected. Is we need to rethink our approval process for tests are used for screening versus tests are used for a medical diagnostic purpose.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. What Mike Minnick calls the crappy tests. We could use a lot more crappy tests.
Yeah, a lot of crappy tests is better than a really good test that takes a week to get the results back.
Yes. Okay, here's a good one. Our middle school is returning to hybrid school at the end of the month. We're told we need to check her temperature every day, but it seems there will be no testing at the school. Colleges are testing their students every day. Shouldn't elementary, middle, and high schools do the same? Tom.
I think in the perfect world, I think that's where the trade-offs come in, right? And Massachusetts is leading the way with the number of tests that we're doing per capita, but still, as a country, we're stuck around 900,000 tests per day. That number hasn't meaningfully moved in the last several months. So I think that's where part of the supply chain issue. Ginkgo Bioworks is a biotech company based in Massachusetts that has a capacity to scale, but they're waiting to on the demand side to see if there will be funding for tests to scale. And I think that's the part of the challenge is we need to focus on there's been a lot of mixed messaging about the role of testing. So the supply hasn't increased to drive up the demand either. So I think that's part of the challenge. Now, the test alone is not therapeutic, right? I think the White House example from the last couple of days is a great example of that. So that doesn't mean that the middle school students are less safe than the college students, because the test just gives you the information. It depends on what you're doing. I'd rather have a middle school that has good masking, physical distancing, screening people to make sure there's no symptoms, doing that very, very robustly than a college campus that tests, but then people are going to parties. So I think that's, again, it's about all of the above. The testing is one piece of the puzzle, but it's not the only piece.
But you project that we actually should be doing millions more tests in the United States per day, right?
It comes down to values, right? There was $75 billion in the stimulus bill, that's on the Hill right now for testing and contact tracing. And specific, we provided some technical assistance to the Suppress COVID-19 Act that was sponsored by bipartisan by Senator Cassidy, Louisiana, and Republican senator, which specifically, brings out this issue to have federal funding for testing, but because of, lots of complex political issues, things aren't progressing. But I think this is a gut check moment for our country is, do we value testing enough for football and basketball and baseball? The question is, do we value enough for our students?
Yeah, can I just add on that? I completely agree with everything Dr. Tsai says. It is a gut check. I also want to acknowledge that testing for specifically public school youth it's a very complicated endeavor. And I keep on mentioning equity. I mean, so it's not just about saying, okay, all students are going to have access to testing. So that's one thing. Ensuring that students with families with different language capabilities understand what testing means, what are the implications of the testing, what are the risks of these tests. And so, we can say that all English-speaking students will be able to read, but if it isn't in a different language, how are we going to communicate these with these families? How are they going to receive the results? And then there's the secondary aspect. If a child tests positive, that means their family needs to quarantine. If you have people who do not have resources to quarantine, do not have a home to quarantine, or if they don't want to be tested because they're concerned about the healthcare system, and is that going to be somehow affect them if there's immigration status issues? So it's such a complex question. I mean, I think Dr. Tsai's point of saying, what is our priority, and is saying it is our priority, that's step one. But I think step 2, step 3, step 4 is saying, okay, well, how can we make this test that is available and affordable and whatever equitably accessible? And what are the ramifications? How are we going to address the ramifications of a positive test equitably as well?
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. All right, I want to go from big questions of equity to people have so many still lingering questions about what's safe and what's not and what's okay to do. So one is the CDC recently sort of adjusted what it's saying about whether particles can kind of linger in an airborne way around us. So one person asked, what's the likelihood of infection if I'm 6 feet away from an infected person in a large open room? Would more distance, like 10 feet, help? Would wearing a mask help? Or would the particles just go through the mask? What would you recommend to reduce the risk? Or, and it sounds like the sub question is, or should we just not be inside? Like,
yeah, I think it's important not to think about the risk as binary, right? It's either 0 or 100%. It's really a gradient of risk. And the fact is, we don't have perfect information, right? Like, you don't know if you're standing next to this person who, may be testing, who may be positive, and because they could be asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic. So it goes back to, my driving analogies that we need to create the conditions for safety, right? That's why we wear seatbelts and have rules of the road and stop signs. I don't know who the drunk driver on the road is, right? But I trust that if everybody follows the rules of the road, that on average, we can make a relatively risky at, which is driving a 2,000 pound lump of metal on 4 wheels as safe as possible, right? And I think that's the way we need to think about the coronavirus as well, as how do we minimize the risks, when we can. And the principles are the exact same that they've been for the last 9 months. Is better ventilation, further distance, whatever you can do to minimize the risk of any of the airborne transmission. All those things together can create the conditions for safety, but nothing is absolute. It's all about minimizing risk, not making it zero.
Okay, we have just time for a couple more questions. I want to get Brookline specific a little bit. So here's one: the loosening of COVID restrictions depends on the case rate in towns and cities. A color map currently shows a green, meaning lower risk Brookline, nearly engulfed by red, higher risk Boston. No offense, Jenifer. How is the case rate being determined in Brookline now? Are random asymptomatic people being tested weekly? So where do these case rates come from? What should we take it to mean that Brookline is green and Boston is red?
So when a case turns up positive, their lab result is reportable to the Massachusetts electronic lab reporting system. And then that information, the address of the person who is tested is determined, and each local jurisdiction is notified about the cases in their particular jurisdiction. So Boston Public Health Commission has access to all Boston residents. Brookline has access to their residents. So I know there were some questions about, if you're diagnosed in a Boston hospital, does it still count as a Brooklyn resident? The answer is yes. It's based on your zip code at time of lab test. And so I think the case that this person made about, so that's how you get the actual cases. You say, okay, what's the total number in any given day? Boston is red, and you're right. I mean, just per capita, 2 cases in Boston per 100,000 is much different than 2 cases per 100,000 in Brookline. So I think the larger picture is that, we're focused very much on this map. I mean, truth be told, there are many factors that we need to look at, many metrics. So for instance, in Boston, we look at 3, we look at the positivity rate, we look at this cases per 100,000. We also look at hospitalization utilization as well as emergency room utilization, because it's not just about the total number of cases that are in the community. I mean, that's obviously a large part of it, but in March and April, when we were really being hit, 125%, we were at 125% ICU capacity. So it was not a lie to say that we were concerned about ventilators, we were concerned about beds. And that stress on the healthcare system is really the impact that we're trying to avoid as much as possible. So there is one metric, there is this sea of red surrounding Brookline's green, but there's a number of other metrics that we need to look at collectively within our own jurisdictions and across the region, because a Brookline resident is going to use a Boston hospital, so they need to care about that stuff. We all need to care about that stuff.
Great. Well, we are out of time, even though I'm so sorry to all the people who sent in questions. We had a lot more. It's just hard to get them all in. I want to give my huge thanks to Michael and Tom and Jenifer. You guys were fantastic. Thank you. And Joyce, let me hand it back to you.
Thank you so much, Carey. You've been a wonderful moderator, and we really appreciate your time and talent in making this a wonderful occasion. And thank you so much to all our viewers. We hope that you'll be with us on future programs as well. And be safe, wear a mask, wash your hands. We love you. Take good care. Bye now.